Hello, and welcome to my first real attempt at a video on this channel. For those who don't already know, I'm Stefan, and I often write and direct episodes of the Link Space, which is an educational channel devoted to bringing the discoveries within the field of linguistics to a wider audience. If you've watched some of our content, or plan to, I tend to have a hand in the episodes that focus on the more mathy side of things. This means episodes that talk about structure, meaning, how we use language, and how we form words. But since I often have ideas floating around in my head that fall outside the scope of that channel, I thought I'd try putting some of them here. First off, I have to give credit to Scott Clifton over at Theoretical Bullshit for inspiring me to finally give this a try. I've been watching his videos for many years, and when I saw that he'd uploaded one about the infamous Modal Ontological Argument, I got very excited because it not only meant he'd returned from his hiatus, but that he was covering something which actually relates to my own background. I'll say, too, that I'm not planning on making this a philosophy channel or anything quite like that. What I'd like to do is take the opportunity that's been provided to see if I can apply the science of language to some questions that might not typically be viewed through that lens. For this video, I want to take a closer look at some of the assumptions made by the modal ontological argument, as it appears in the Theoretical Bullshits video, and why I don't think they hold up. So, if you haven't watched yet, I definitely recommend checking out his channel. Now, let's do some linguistics. Alright, one of the key premises in the argument involves this thing called S5, which is a particular system of modal logic, the kind of logic that deals in concepts like possibility and necessity. Modal logic can make different foundational assumptions about how the system should operate, and depending on which assumptions get made, we have different names for those systems. You've got System K, System T, S4, S5. The way that last one works is that it makes three specific assumptions, which I'm going to spend some time covering, and spend some more time explaining why I think it's probably not sensible to make them. What are the assumptions being made by S5? To get there, we have to understand that modal logic makes use of a technical tool known as an accessibility relation. It sounds a bit scary, but we'll see that it's not so different from many of the things we experience in everyday life. As the name suggests, an accessibility relation is a kind of relation, where a relation is something that relates two things to one another. For instance, the idea of two people being cousins. If I take my cousin Danny, then the cousin relation holds between us. If I take my friend Moti, then that relation doesn't hold. Other relations include being the same age as each other, being taller than someone, really any way you can think of to connect or compare two people or things. An accessibility relation in modal logic is a relation that connects together one of the basic building blocks of modal logic, which are these things called possible worlds. That sounds very sci-fi, but it's really just another tool that makes it easier to capture the ideas that modal logic sets out to represent. In modal logic, if you want to say that something is possible, say that it's possible it'll snow tomorrow, you could write out diamond P, where the P stands for precipitation and the diamond represents possibility. What that diamond is doing there is saying that in at least one possible world, specifically one possible future, it'll snow. It might not be a certainty, but it's one possible outcome. To express more certainty using modal logic, you could write out box P, where that box asserts that snow is the only possible outcome, that all possible futures, no matter what else might happen tomorrow, involve snow. So possible worlds allow us to precisely express in symbols these ideas. Either one possible future involves snow, or all of them do, possibility and necessity. The accessibility relation is the relation that connects whichever world we're currently considering to those other worlds which may or may not be so. In our weather example, depending on which accessibility relation we choose, we can mean slightly different things by diamond P. If we want to say that the forecast we saw calls for snow, we could choose to use an evidence-based relation, where we only consider possible worlds that are compatible with what we know to be true. In fact, the possibility for snow comes out as false using this relation, since according to everything I know right now, the conditions tomorrow don't allow for snow. But if I choose a different accessibility relation, say one based purely on the laws of logic, then the possibility for snow comes out true, since it's logically possible for it to snow tomorrow, which is to say I can imagine what snow tomorrow would look like, even if I have no good reason to believe it'll actually happen. Modal logic, then, lets us symbolize possibility and necessity, and lets us choose whether we're making a statement about knowledge, rules, hopes and dreams, or pure logic, by allowing us to fiddle with the accessibility relation that connects together different possible worlds. Going back to S5, we've got a system of modal logic that makes three very specific assumptions about the nature of the accessibility relation we're supposedly using in the argument. Those assumptions are that the relation is reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. Reflexive means it relates all worlds to themselves, just like how the relation of being the same age as someone relates me to me and you to you, since everyone is the same age as themselves. Symmetric means that it relates worlds in both directions, just like how the cousin relation does. If someone is a cousin to me, then I'm also a cousin to them. Finally, transitive means that if a world connects to a second world, and that second world connects to a third, the first is automatically connected to the third. This is like the taller than relation, since if Jane is taller than Jerry, and Jerry's taller than Jennifer, then Jane is necessarily taller than Jennifer. So, S5 is a system of modal logic that connects together possible worlds by relation that is reflexive, symmetric, and transitive. But is this relation really the right choice? For the rest of our time together, I'm going to try to convince you that it's not. To do that, we first need to decide what kind of possibility we're talking about when we're pondering whether or not such a thing as a maximally great being exists. Then, we need to ask the question, is that particular flavor of possibility reflexive, symmetric, and transitive? If it's not, then S5 is making an assumption that contradicts the first premise, since it assumes all three of those properties. The core of my argument is that when we're deciding whether it's possible for a maximally great being to exist, we're unavoidably making a statement about our own knowledge, which is to say, when we judge something like this to be possible, it doesn't default to some grand metaphysical sense of the word possible, but instead a knowledge-based possible, which will inevitably vary from person to person and over time. To get a sense of the difference, consider whether you believe it's possible, based on your intuition and without doing any calculating, that the square root of 3,932,289 is a prime number. You may not know for sure, but could it be so? It seems to me the answer is yes, since most of us are unlikely to know what that number is off the tops of our heads, and whether or not it's prime. And yet, in the end, it isn't. 1,983 is not a prime number, and so it's impossible, according to the mathematical definitions, for the square root of that larger number to be prime. Now that you know 1,983 isn't prime, you might say it isn't possible, but that's only by virtue of you getting an update. In other words, we're still dealing in knowledge, not pure logic. There are an infinity of things that the average person is likely to judge as possible, but which really aren't, because all we have to go on is what we know now, which is finite. In fact, a number of linguists have concluded that natural languages simply don't recognize pure logical modality as a distinct category, in the same way they do for knowledge-based modality. While many languages have dedicated morphemes marking different kinds of modality, like epistemic or deontic, it's not immediately clear that there are any that deal in pure logic. This isn't to say it's an incoherent concept, and we can most definitely talk about logical possibility and necessity using natural language. We can push towards the interpretation we want with the right wording and context, using symbols when we need to. But with a bare claim about possibility, like the one we're dealing with, it's somewhere between difficult and impossible to be sure we've completely disentangled it from a knowledge claim, especially with no overt grammatical indicators. We can insist that the premise represents a purely logical notion, but it seems likely that in using the word possible, people generally mean something more like this doesn't contradict what I currently understand to be true, which can include a mastery of the laws of logic, but isn't limited to them. Now, if our use of the word possible is on some level knowledge-centered, at least in this scenario, we have to ask whether a knowledge-based accessibility relation has the properties needed to live in harmony with S5. Is it compatible with that system of logic? As it turns out, the answer is no. To see why, it helps to understand that when a relation is reflexive, symmetric, and transitive, it's what's known as an equivalence relation. The equal sign in mathematics is maybe the clearest example of an equivalence relation, but our same age as relation from before is 1, too, since it's reflexive, goes in both directions for any two people that share their age, and because being as old as one person who shares their age with another necessarily means being as old as the other. Equivalence relations are special because when they connect collections of things together, like possible worlds, they connect them completely, meaning that as long as a possible world is connected to one other world in the network, it's connected to all of them. It's like how I'm connected by my age to everyone else who's as old as me. And that means that if a knowledge-based accessibility relation were an equivalence relation, every possible world in the network would be able to link to every other possible world, and that has some significant implications. Most notably, it would mean that whenever you don't know something, you know you don't know it. This happens because we can think of our knowledge not just as a set of statements, but as a set of possible worlds where all those statements are true. To know something, then, is for it to be true in every one of our knowledge worlds. To not know something means there's at least one world, maybe more, where that thing isn't true. But if there were something we didn't know, that would mean there's a world in our network where that thing isn't true. And that would mean that every other world in our network has access to it because of the equivalence relation. And if that's true of every world, that there is a world in its network where some particular thing is false, then we know that, since that's how we define knowledge in modal logic. So we always know about what we don't know in a case where our knowledge is held together by an equivalence relation. But this doesn't make sense. Imagine a situation where I was sure the moon was made of cheese. It would be safe to say it's not true that I know the moon's made of cheese, since in the real world it isn't. But if knowledge depended on an equivalence relation, I should know that I don't know it's made of cheese. I should know that, but I don't in this scenario. Instead, I mistakenly believe just the opposite, that I do know it's made of cheese. Put simply, we aren't aware of our false beliefs, because if we were, we wouldn't have them. All this means that an equivalence relation is a bad way of modeling how we talk about what we know. If talk of what we feel is possible were based on an equivalence relation, things would work very differently from how they actually do. And if that kind of talk can't be captured with an equivalence relation, it can't be a good idea to assume S5 as our system when reasoning through what's possible and what isn't. There's an irreconcilable difference between that system and how we typically think about these sorts of things. All this means that S5 is not actually a safe assumption to make, at least not here. So, I hope I've managed to show that in looking at an argument like the modal ontological argument, we have to be wary of how language actually works. It turns out that there really are better and worse ways to model how we talk to each other, and we should be cautious of explanations that clash with the facts on the ground. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you soon.